For decades, the world has looked at Canada and seen a polite neighbor, a quiet trading partner. America's hat. But as talk of annexation shifts from fringe podcasts to serious political debate in Washington, it is time to remind the world of something it often forgets. Canada is not a country you invade. It is a fortress disguised as a nation. On a map, Canada doesn't look like a state. It looks like a continent. And that scale changes everything. As figures around Donald Trump float threats toward Ottawa, the real question isn't about rhetoric. It's about reality. If the U.S. military actually pushed north, could NATO defend us? But more importantly, would the American war machine bog down in the snow long before it ever reached the finish line? As always, the clearest place to start is with the numbers, because they shape everything that follows. Canada maintains a relatively small but professional force, roughly 75,000 active-duty personnel, backed by around 27,000 reservists. Layered on top of that is a uniquely Canadian asset, the Canadian Rangers. About 5,600 volunteers drawn from remote and Indigenous communities, they function as the permanent eyes and ears of the Arctic and the far north. Together, this gives Canada a compact force, optimized not for expeditionary wars, but for territorial defense and intimate knowledge of its own terrain. And as the defender, Canada would not be static. An American attack would almost certainly trigger a surge in enlistment, something democracies historically see when homeland survival is at stake. Within months, Canadian force numbers would likely swell dramatically, not only through formal military expansion, but through local militias, community defense units, and reserve mobilization across the country. Across the border, the United States dwarfs Canada on paper, roughly 1.3 million active-duty troops backed by massive reserve and National Guard formations. The manpower gap is undeniable. In theory, that allows Washington to generate overwhelming force quickly. In practice, geography, economics, and domestic politics complicate the picture. A significant portion of U.S. military power is not sitting at home. Around 206,000 American personnel are stationed overseas, concentrated in Japan, Germany, South Korea, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Canada, by contrast, has only about 3,000 deployed abroad, mostly in the Baltics as part of NATO's forward presence. For Canadian planners and their NATO partners, one of the earliest warning signs of escalation would likely be U.S. forces rotating back home, because those overseas units often form the leading edge of any major American operation. The same imbalance appears in equipment. Canada fields roughly 80 Leopard 2 main battle tanks. Its artillery arm centers on about 33 M777 towed howitzers, with another 100 older 105mm guns in reserve. Ottawa is in the middle of modernizing, with plans to acquire 80 to 90 self-propelled artillery systems from European suppliers. On the armored side, Canada relies heavily on wheeled platforms. The backbone is the domestically produced LAV family, around 550 upgraded LAV-3 and LAV-6 vehicles, supported by roughly 360 armored combat support vehicles. In total, the LAV-based fleet approaches 900 vehicles, emphasizing mobility, survivability, and operations across vast distances rather than brute armored mass. Taken together, this isn't the profile of a country built to invade others. It's the profile of a country built to make invasion costly, slow, complex, and politically dangerous. And in a conflict where alliances, legitimacy, and escalation matter as much as firepower, those factors may prove just as decisive as raw numbers. On top of this, Canada also operates more than 1,000 lighter armored vehicles, including articulated platforms, MRAPS, and other protected mobility systems designed for rough terrain and dispersed operations. These assets don't grab headlines, but they matter in a defensive war fought across vast distances. The United States, by contrast, fields forces on an entirely different scale. Its armored brigade combat teams alone operate roughly 1,400 Abrams main battle tanks. Supporting them are around 670 M109 self-propelled artillery systems, alongside a towed artillery fleet measured in the high hundreds. Add in approximately 400 HIMARS and MLRS launchers, and the U.S. Army's total artillery inventory climbs well beyond 2,000 tubes and launchers. Then there are the vehicles. The U.S. fields thousands of infantry fighting vehicles and wheeled combat platforms, around 2,400 Bradley IFVs, and more than 4,000 Stryker vehicles. And that's before accounting for Humvees, MRAPs, Joint Light Tactical Vehicles, and the rest of the logistics backbone. When everything is counted across all branches, the total U.S. vehicle inventory likely approaches 100,000 platforms. But there's an important caveat. A large share of that inventory is either in long-term storage or positioned overseas. Activating it takes time, and moving it takes even more time. Heavy armor doesn't teleport. It flows through ports, railheads, bridges, and highways. And that's where theory meets terrain. On the ground, the map still favors the defender. There is a hard physical limit to how much armor you can push into a country before logistics begin to choke themselves. Russia learned that lesson outside Kyiv in 2022, when massed columns became traffic jams and traffic jams became kill zones. Canada's geography imposes similar constraints, but on a far larger scale. Canadian forces are optimized for their own territory. Mechanized infantry, mobile Levis brigades, and a compact tank force trained for ambush and long-range sniping in forests, wetlands, and Arctic approaches. By contrast, U.S. brigades excel at mass logistics and long-range fires, advantages that are overwhelming in a clean, set-piece fight with intact supply lines and permissive terrain. That kind of battle strongly favors the attacker. But Canada doesn't have to give the United States that fight. Instead, it can adopt the same defensive logic Ukraine has employed: trade space for time. Bleed supply lines using terrain and cheap FPV drones. Force the attacker to clear cities block by block, taking disproportionate casualties. Turn every advance into a potential supply trap rather than a breakthrough. An initial Canadian defense would likely aim to blunt U.S. momentum rather than stop it outright. A small number of armored formations would hold choke points, demolish crossings, and sever key routes. Bridges like the Ambassador Bridge, along with hundreds of lesser-known road and rail links that cross rivers and lakes between the two countries. Meanwhile, the bulk of Canadian forces would withdraw into terrain that is cheaper to defend and vastly harder to occupy. History offers perspective here. In 1945, Allied armies fighting with total air superiority and overwhelming armored strength advanced roughly 950 kilometers into Europe over 10 grueling months before reaching the Elbe River. Still about 120 kilometers short of Berlin. Transposed onto Canada, that distance doesn't even get you halfway through British Columbia. In other words, Canada has almost unlimited territory to trade for casualties. And outside its major metropolitan areas, much of Canada is dense woodland, broken terrain, and remote regions that are difficult to access, let alone sustain at scale. Air power would likely define the opening phase of any conflict, and here too the numbers tell a familiar story. Canada is in the middle of upgrading its fighter fleet. Roughly 89 legacy CF-18 Hornets remain in service, and in a conflict scenario, they would almost certainly avoid direct air superiority contests. Instead, they would likely disperse to northern bases and focus on defensive counter-air missions, intercepting missiles and incoming munitions, much like Ukrainian aircraft have done against Russia. Canada operates no strategic bombers and lacks its own airborne early warning aircraft. That reality shapes its doctrine. The goal would not be dominance, but survival, preserving enough capability to deny the attacker uncontested airspace and prolong the fight long enough for political, economic, and alliance pressures to take effect. And in wars between democracies, time is rarely a neutral factor. For intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, Canada relies on roughly 14 CP-140 Aurora Patrol and intelligence aircraft. For airlift, it fields 5 C-17 Globemaster strategic transports alongside 17 C-130 Hercules medium-lift aircraft. These capabilities allow Canada to move forces internally and maintain situational awareness, but they are limited in scale. The United States, by contrast, brings mass at every tier of air power. The U.S. Air Force fighter fleet alone numbers around 2,000 aircraft across multiple types. The U.S. Navy adds roughly another 450 carrier-based fighters, while the Marine Corps is on track to field around 200 F-35s by the end of the year. Taken together, America's total fighter inventory exceeds 2,600 aircraft across the three services. The bomber force adds further depth, with roughly 120 active bombers available. For airborne early warning, the U.S. Air Force operates around 15 E-3 Sentry aircraft, complemented by the Navy's carrier-borne E-2D Hawkeye fleet, which totals roughly 78 aircraft. And then there is airlift. Across the force, the United States fields around 500 heavy and medium transport aircraft backed by an enormous tanker fleet. This gives Washington the ability to seize airfields and ports rapidly and to move forces at continental scale. That level of air dominance is why the United States could, in theory, secure key nodes quickly. It is also why the first 48 to 72 hours of any North American campaign would likely appear brutal and highly one-sided. If you're Canadian, this is the point where the numbers start to feel discouraging, and on paper they are. But this is also where the analysis shifts. Because a real conflict would almost certainly not resemble the kind of uninterrupted shock and awe campaign some American planners imagine. Maritime geography alone complicates the picture. By tonnage, the U.S. Navy is unmatched. Estimates place total U.S. fleet displacement at roughly 4 million tons of warship tonnage. The Royal Canadian Navy, by contrast, operates a far smaller fleet. Based on the displacement of Halifax-class frigates, Victoria-class submarines, Harry DeWolf-class patrol vessels, Kingston-class coastal ships, and the Protector-class auxiliary, Canada's total active fleet displacement sits at roughly 130,000 tons. But as Ukraine has demonstrated, attacking a large country with vast inland territory using naval power is a very different problem than dominating open seas. Canada's navy, while small, is nimble. It can disperse into countless fjords, inlets, and complex coastal terrain, avoiding direct confrontation and striking opportunistically rather than seeking decisive naval battles. And modern warfare has lowered the threshold for damage. As we've seen repeatedly, it doesn't take many missiles or even drone boats and legacy anti-ship weapons to cripple or sink capital ships. The Royal Canadian Navy operates vessels equipped with harpoon missiles and torpedoes, capable of darting out from coastal cover, firing, and disappearing again. In practice, this means the U.S. Navy would likely rely heavily on air power to hunt down Canadian naval assets before moving large surface formations close to Canadian shores. Which brings us back to the core question. Should Canada simply give up? The answer is no. After the initial phase of American shock and awe, after some southern territory and major urban centers potentially fall under U.S. control, the most difficult phase of the war would begin for the occupier. Holding ground is far harder than taking it. Canada's rural gun culture matters here. Licensed firearms ownership runs into the millions. Hunting rifles, shotguns, and a significant number of semi-automatic platforms are common across rural provinces and the territories. Hunters, trappers, indigenous communities, and remote towns bring with them local terrain knowledge, mobility assets like snowmobiles and ATVs, and a cultural familiarity with living off the land. That creates a distributed pool of potential resistance and a constant security problem for any occupying force, one that must simultaneously hold cities, protect supply lines, and police an enormous countryside. And then there are the external pressures. Politically, the fallout would be enormous. A U.S. attack on Canada would shatter core NATO assumptions and trigger near-universal international condemnation. NATO and Commonwealth allies would face a binary choice: side with the aggressor, oppose it, or watch the alliance fracture under the strain. And once alliances begin to crack, military victories become far harder to convert into lasting political outcomes. The diplomatic, economic, and legal consequences would be immediate. Financial access would freeze. Foreign governments could begin calling in U.S. debt, a serious issue given America's roughly $40 trillion debt burden. U.S. firms could be expelled from foreign markets, overseas bases could be shuttered, and momentum would build toward abandoning the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Taken together, the soft power cost to the United States as a superpower would be incalculable. That cascading diplomatic fallout is a deterrent in its own right. For all the overwhelming hardware and the hypothetical war plans reportedly dreamed up in cable news studios, the single biggest obstacle to invading Canada sits inside the United States itself: public opinion. Polling on the so-called 51st state idea is brutally clear. Roughly half of Americans oppose it outright. Another significant portion say they would only even consider it if Canadians themselves asked for it. Well over 90% offer either no support or only highly conditional support. There is no popular mandate for a war of annexation against a friendly democracy. Then there is the geography of U.S. politics. 13 American states share a border with Canada. Most of them, Washington, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, lean or vote Democratic. These are precisely the states whose National Guard units, ports, rail hubs, and air bases would be essential as launch pads for any invasion. Their governors and legislatures would face enormous pressure to delay, obstruct, or openly refuse cooperation. Compounding the problem, a substantial share of active-duty U.S. forces are stationed in blue or swing states, such as California and Virginia. You would be asking soldiers drawn from those communities to fight a deeply unpopular war against a neighbor that most Americans still view as an ally. That is a recipe not just for protests, but for a serious constitutional and civil military crisis. So, to answer the core question, could Canada and its allies defend Canada from the United States in the opening phase? Yeah, probably not. The U.S. holds clear advantages in air, naval, and land power, along with unmatched surge capacity. An initial occupation of southern Canadian territory would be plausible, but occupation is not victory. When it comes to consolidation and long-term control, the balance shifts decisively toward the defender. Geography, local resistance, economic interdependence, and political backlash all work against the attacker. The likely operational reality would be grim, rapid early gains, followed by a slow, costly occupation that drains resources, fractures alliances, and damages the attacker's economy, political stability, and global standing. In short, the odds point toward internal American turmoil long before a successful American conquest of Canada. And it bears repeating, Canada is widely supported across the Pacific, the Commonwealth, and Europe. Taken together, that represents well over 700 million people and armed forces that, even if only partially mobilized, would stretch American focus far beyond Canada alone. At some level, even the most aggressive strategists understand this. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, have a good weekend.